Kathy Riley's been asking me to tell these stories for so many years that on some level it really started to feel a little bit mundane. But the more and more I've thought about it, the more I've realized really how strange my childhood was. At least those really early years. I mean, up until I went off to school, I was 4.5 years old. I was really living in my own world. I grew up with Baba parents. I was a single child. Grew up in a big old plantation house in the middle of the woods. So never really spent much time with other children my age until I went to school. And it was always just Mom and the woods and the wind, the pond, that big old house. And Dad was around sometimes, so he was usually staying pretty busy. But all those first years, Baba was a big presence in my life. It's funny, I had all the normal sort of childhood mystery about the world and animals and plants and the way things worked, but when it came to really the biggest questions of why we're here and what's the meaning of life and all those things, I had such a certainty and deep conviction in that, and I never questioned any of it. And that, I think, came from being raised with Baba and the fact that really until I was about 4 years old, Baba very much was a physical presence in my life. My earliest memories of him, I was, maybe 2 years old, playing in the sandbox. My mom had set up a sandbox out under this oak tree just outside, underneath the kitchen window so she could cook and do all of her experimentation and things, but keep an eye on me. And she would notice, looking out and checking on me, that for days and days I would have these odd moments of just staring off into space from the sandbox and smiling and laughing. And finally one day she just had to go out and ask, what are you looking at? What are you smiling? And I guess when she asked me this, I must have been 2.5. And so I said, I gestured to the air and I said, Baba, can't you see him? He's right there. And my mom looked, and of course she only saw empty space. And she just shook her head and said, no, Nathan, I think that must be a gift just for you. Which I'm glad she definitely handled it well. But I remember, especially those being my earliest memories of Baba, being in that sandbox. It was so strange. He would never interact with me directly, but he would stand or sometimes crouch not too far away. He always appeared to me in the same way. I think it was a mid-30s, 1930s. He had that pink overcoat, that it was always that same way, the long, wavy hair. And he would just, sometimes smile and nod approvingly, and I just remembered I enjoyed his presence so much because he would send these waves of love at me. And like I said, this continued on for years to the point where I remembered when I got older and we started coming to the Mayor Spiritual Center down in Myrtle Beach, people would always talk about Baba passing in '69, and I was confused all the way until I was 8 or 9 years old because I was like, what do you mean? He came to visit me all the time. He was like a relative. But I remember being in that sandbox, enjoying Baba's presence, and I was so young at that time that I had this very strange sense there was a sense of newness to life. I still had this sense that I had been somewhere else and that this life and this world was a new thing. But I felt that Baba was a constant throughout that. And so I was very happy. I knew the universe was a safe place and that, I'd been with Baba and I'd come into this world and, that this life was just something everybody has to go through and it would only last for a while and then I'd go back to Baba, so I knew everything was fine. And so many days in the sandbox like that. That's my first story, I guess you'd say. The second real story is out behind the big plantation house. We had this right off the back porch. There's this big magnolia tree that, all the kids, my half siblings and children of previous generations had climbed. It was this big tree. It had strong limbs going all the way down to the ground. So even if you were just 4 years old, you could climb up pretty high. I think my brother had even, gone up there and stuck nails in the tree to mark, how high he'd gotten before. I'm not sure if I ever got that high, at least not until I was maybe 10 years old. But one day, I guess I must have been about 4 years old, and it was kind of a boring day. And I climbed that tree many times, but I always stopped when I got maybe 5 feet off the ground or so. And I was bored that day and was feeling a little bit more grown up, so I just figured, today, instead of just climbing the tree, I'm going to really climb as high as I can go, go into uncharted territory. And so I'm sure my mom was working away in the kitchen like normal, but, facing the counter or the stove or anything like that, her back would have been to the window where the tree was. And so I climbed and climbed and climbed until I got, maybe a good, at least 15, feet up or so. And that was when I started getting to branches that, there were some branches that couldn't support my weight, which was a new problem. And I was like, okay, this is too much guesswork. This feels dangerous. I want to go back down. And so I tried to go back down and ran into that problem that so many children climbing trees or people on a stepladder for the first time do, which is just, I couldn't feel any branches beneath me. I would reach and reach with my foot, and I just felt empty air. And I kept trying, and then I started to panic, as a little child would, thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to be stuck up here, I'm going to get tired, I'm going to fall, it's going to be horrible. And just as I was about to really burst into tears and like start sobbing and almost having a tantrum, I heard what at the time sounded like my father's voice down below that said, reassured me and said, it's okay, you just have to reach your foot further. And so I tried a couple more times, really stretched my leg, and I couldn't find it. It was still more empty air, and I just said, I can't do it, I don't know what to do. And then that voice said, here. And I felt clear as day, a hand grab the back of my heel and place it on the branch below. And then I realized I really did just have to reach another inch and a half. And so then I got the idea of like, okay, I really do just have to reach a little bit farther. So I moved down one, and the voice continued to guide me. Okay, now bring your left foot down, a little bit more to the left. There you go. Now your right foot, and sort of continued in that way until I got maybe about halfway down. And then my mom comes running out of the back of the house. She was always a little on edge, and she said, oh, Nathan, oh my God, are you okay? What are you doing? And I said, I'm fine. Hush, can't you see he's helping me? And I never backtalked my mother. So she just crossed her arms and stopped saying anything. And, I guess she stood there, but she wouldn't have gone back inside. But anyway, so the voice continued to guide me down out of the tree, and I finally got down to the last limb and, hopped down, turned around, and my father was nowhere to be seen. And of course, I remembered he must have been in town. I'm sure it was an errand day, or he was at work or something. But I remember, at the time being 4 years old and having my, feeling like I had my thorough understanding of the universe. I thought it's like, oh, well, I was at the top of the tree. I was absolutely terrified. And so, of course, God helped me. That's how things work. God wouldn't let a little child be terrified to death. And I didn't think anything of it after that. Until the last time I saw Baba, really saw him as if he was right there with me. I was 4.5 years old. It was the same house. Not too long after this, my parents split up, and Mom and I moved away from the house. But it was, I guess for context, like I said, it was a big old plantation house out in the middle of the woods. So there was this long, quarter of a mile long avenue that would come up to the front of the house, and there was a big circle. If somebody just needed to drop something off or pick up some Tupperware, they'd come that way. But if we had family staying for a reunion or Thanksgiving or something like that, any length of time, they would park in the back. That's where the kitchen was and everything. But we had this system, Southern goodbyes being so long, that if we had family come over for Thanksgiving and it was, finally time for them to leave after however many days, they would always pack up the car in the back, and then you would pull around front and leave the car running. And that way we'd say our goodbyes out there. And that way there's a little bit of the time pressure of the car's right behind us, it's out front, it's running. So that way you can't, 15 minutes doesn't turn into 2.5 hours. So I remember associating that front of the house at the head of the avenue with, I was a little kid, I basically felt like I might never see my cousins again. I mean, if I wasn't going to see them for a year or 8 months, it's like, well, that's basically forever. Who knows what's going to happen? So with that in mind, one afternoon, maybe in the spring, it was a warm, clear afternoon anyway, I was out on the front porch. I spent a lot of time out there because it was one of the only places, at least by the house, where you could get a good look at the sky because it was open. Everything else around the house was forested. And I like to watch to the end of the avenue because it was, even though it was a quarter mile long, it was perfectly straight. So if anybody was coming to visit or drop something off, you could see them approaching. And one day I saw this bright red car, this Jeep as it turned out, coming down the avenue. And I thought it was strange because, it must have been like, there were certain people that we knew to expect, and if anybody was coming who hadn't planned to, days before or wasn't regular, it was 2002, they'd call the landline, they'd call ahead, they'd say, hey, I'm coming to get such and such, or speak to, whoever. And I knew I'd never seen this car before, and there'd been no phone call, so I wondered, who is this? And so the Jeep, this bright red Jeep came down and pulled around the avenue up to the front steps, and being this child raised in the woods with no real sense of stranger danger, I ran around the back of the Jeep up to the driver's side door to see who this person was. And I saw Baba sitting there driving in the Jeep, one arm ever so casually hanging out, hand on the steering wheel, and he just looked at me. And at the time I just thought, oh great, I love this guy. I love when he comes to visit. He comes to visit all the time. And so, I walked up the driver's side door, and, Baba, I reached up my hand, and Baba took my right hand and grabbed him in both of his, which may have been, unless you count the tree, may have been the first time anything like that had happened. He was there, and I could see him, and I could feel him, but he had never touched me before. And so for a moment, he just held my hand, and I just kind of stood there, absorbing the love and the bliss that I had come to expect, because it was such a, it was an otherworldly experience, and I enjoyed it. But then I realized that Baba was looking into my eyes, and he seemed to be conveying to me that there was some more significance to this interaction. And then Baba, in his uniquely personal way, it all sort of clicked at once in my little 4-year-old head. I realized, oh, we're at the front of the house, we're at the head of the avenue. And I realized that Baba was telling me that this was the last time I was going to see him for a very long time. But on some inner level, he reassured me that he would always be with me, and that he would always love me, and that one day I would return to him. And then he let go of my hand, and I ran. I didn't think much of it. He'd always been around. I was just 4 years old, so I ran around the back of the Jeep to go run up the front steps and tell my mom what had happened. And I got up to the top of the steps and turned around just to see if he was still there, and he'd vanished completely. And the real significance of that didn't hit me until years later because I'd been so used to his presence, but that was indeed the last time I ever saw him as if he were physically right there in front of me. And from there on out, I entered the school system and joined the world, and I was on my own. But that was always in the back of my mind.
The next part of this amazing and blessed journey that Nathan has had this lifetime, I feel continued when Tom and I had a very strong feeling that Nathan should go to India. And you were, how old were you, Nathan?
10.
10. And we were able to secure some help from the wonderful Kristen Keeler's fund that helped first-time folks who needed some assistance to get there. Her fund was able to help this to happen, and Nathan and his parents both went to India. So I would love to just hear any memories or remembrances of what were some highlights of that trip for you, because I just love to hear that myself. And I know you said at first the culture shock was a little much.
No, that was kind of unfortunately, that was pretty much the summation of it. I wish I'd had some real sacred experiences. Both of my parents did, but I think being 10 years old and being in India, it was, I was so overwhelmed by the newness and the difference of everything. Not afraid, not deeply uncomfortable, not in a negative way, but I was just so stimulated by all of that newness and difference that I think it kind of spiritually blocked me off to a degree. I didn't really.
But then I seem to remember you saying that, I don't know how many months after you returned, mm-hmm. somehow something kicked in. Yeah,
after I returned, that was when I had my darshan experience in the barn. It was less than a year later. I hadn't seen Baba or had a really deep spiritual experience in years, since those first stories. But after coming back from India, maybe 8 or 9 months later, I was back at the Mare Spiritual Center and just staying with my mother, and we went to visit the barn, and I went to kneel at Baba's chair in the barn and take darshan, and I remember this sense of love and warmth spreading from my shoulders, as if somebody had set their hands on the back of my shoulders. And it started at my shoulders and then the tip of my head, and this kind of, at first it was just a bit of warmth, but then it became this love and bliss quickly flew all the way down my body to my feet, and it was so unlike when I was, just 4 years old. This time it was so overwhelming, I blacked out completely. I lost all sense of who I was or where I was. I just started sobbing. I mean, it was out of joy and bliss, but I was just sobbing. And the next thing I remember, we were walking through the woods, I guess, back to the main part of the center, and I remember some woman stopped to ask if I was okay, and my mother reassured her. But that's all I remember from that day. I don't remember anything else from that stay other than that experience. But that was an intense experience that stuck with me just like the others.
So I wonder if the barn is your favorite place on the center.
I think so. I have to agree with everyone nowadays that I do certainly feel, I guess almost on a more objective level, that there's more energy in Baba's house in the lagoon cabin. I do since that, but the barn will always be my favorite place in my heart for that reason.
Mm. Yeah. And then I always think of you as being such a brave person, although you probably don't see it that way, that you returned to rural South Carolina surrounded by fiery Baptists.
It wasn't bravery. It was just that's the way life was. That's why I cried when I had to leave India, is because at the New Pilgrim Center I got to feel normal again, and then always going back in the middle of rural South Carolina, like you say, Baptist Methodist country. There's this whole deep part of me where it was just understand that you could not speak about it. I tried from time to time, but it was always, as I've said before, it was generally the best case scenario would be that people would consider me some pitiful creature that was destined for the pits of hell. And at worst, there were a lot of parents who thought that I was some sort of agent of Satan who was trying to, who was trying to, lead their children astray. And so, you have a couple conversations like that, and you kind of just, especially being a child, just trying to fit in at school, you just learn to drop the whole thing. And I think it was for that reason, in large part, that I was sort of atheist agnostic for a number of years, just out of pure survival. It was just not an acceptable way to look at the world in the rural South.
There was, I always feel, a saving grace in that when you went to school in Manning.
Yeah, and in 6th grade, I went to private, or 5th and 6th grade. I went to private schools up until 7th grade because my mom just figured they might provide a better education, which was true in some ways and not true in other ways, but that's a different story. But anyway, in this part of the country, the only private schools are, some variation of Christian. So this was the second Baptist private school I'd been to. And I latched onto this Indian kid who was in my grade everybody called him Andy. His legal name was Indrajit, but we really stuck together. His parents had moved here, had moved to Chicago from Gujarat, and I think he was, born basically as soon as they got off the plane in Chicago, but he lived most of his life in South Carolina. And we just clung to each other because I think his parents had the same philosophy of like, oh, it's a private school, it's got to be a better education. So we were two, people who did not at all spiritually or culturally fit in, who were just like shoved into the school. And we found each other and we just clung to each other and we're like, oh, good, right? These people are the crazy ones, right? I remember, I was telling a friend just the other day, I remember being, his parents had a motel, and behind the front desk was sort of their apartment, and I remember being over at his house one day, I think in 6th grade, in his bedroom playing video games, and even then, just us 6th graders, we were sitting on his bed and talking, and we were just like, I don't get it, what's with the whole like eternal punishment thing? They're so focused on this eternal damnation, it's like, how does that even, how does that make any sense? Even if God were to damn you eternally, why would I even want to worship him? Even us just being in 6th grade, we're going back and forth like that, and it was such a comfort to have each other. And his mom made really good chai and all kinds of Indian street food, and stuff that she made up on her own, and we'd get sugar cane juice from the sugar cane that she grew up back in their personal garden. They were followers of Sai Baba,
of Shirdi
Sai Baba, and so, we were able to keep each other sane.
That was, as I think of it now, it's such a gift from Baba to you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that kind of kept me a bit spiritually grounded, I think. Mm-hmm.
And then you have mentioned that you became drawn to Buddhism.
That's a very long story. That's a very long, different story. But
that's kept you...
get into it. But
yeah.
The short version of it is, after many years of an atheist and agnostic, I kind of basically left Baba behind just out of, trying to fit in for sheer survival. My parents, I think, Dad held on to Baba stronger, but I think Mom also kind of mostly dropped Baba out of survival. And, but they'd always encouraged me to, be open-minded, ask questions, come to my own conclusions. So naturally, I love to read, and I really got inclined towards science and all of that. And very much a sort of, almost 18th century mentality of reason can illuminate everything. So I really focused on school. I loved every type of science. I mean, biology, astronomy, everything. I just couldn't, get enough of it. But finally, in high school, I entered some really advanced curriculum, like college credit type stuff. And they were really laying it on us. I remember, I'd go to school and work all day, and then I'd get home and work and work and work until, I'd eat dinner, maybe rest for an hour, and work until 2 in the morning. And I just got stuck in this cycle. And I just remember that was the first time I got really depressed. And I would get home from school and I'd just stare at the ceiling and just try and get to the bottom of what's life supposed to be. And one day I kind of just came to the conclusion of like, well, I don't know if there's a God. I don't know for sure if there's any deeper meaning to anything, but life doesn't make any sense unless like you're trying to be happy, unless you're trying to enjoy it. So I'd been experimenting with meditation for a number of years because I knew there was science and data, behind that, and MRI scans and all that. So I started to, I decided, I guess this is maybe either sophomore or junior year of high school, I decided I needed a spiritual foundation, regardless of how I felt about some of the mystical sides of things or whatever. I said, I need this to survive. And so I started getting into Buddhism and meditating, and I just delved deeper and deeper and deeper over the course of years until college, when I finally started actually going to a Buddhist temple and meditating more consistently and, committing to a specific tradition. And it's a whole long separate story about, graduation and COVID and how I came back to Baba, but Buddhism eventually led me to be more open to the mystical side of things through meditative experiences I'd had, and, monastics I'd spoken with. And eventually it all led back to Baba when I found I read all those books I couldn't read when I was 4 years old and realized, it sort of dusted a lot of cobwebs off of some of the big points of debate in the modern Buddhist world.
So since I've never really heard your version of coming back to Baba, that's kind of an interesting part of this journey.
It's interesting, but it's deeply personal.
Mm-hmm.
The short version of it is, it took certain inner knowings that I had that Buddhism either didn't cover or said were not necessarily important, like a certainty, like conviction and an oversoul. And a conviction, via my own experience, that there was some sort of will behind the universe and the way that things seemed to play out in my life. It seemed like it wasn't just karma. Of course, Buddhism has plenty to say about karma, but it didn't feel like just karma. It felt like prayers and responses and things. And, there wasn't any room in Buddhism for this oversoul, for this will that I seemed to be experiencing. And so I slowly came back and, I had a bunch of Baba books around, so I started reading them. And I remember just one day, I guess particularly after I had a bit of a spiritual crisis with Buddhism, which is a whole other story. So I was, for the first time in many years, starting to look into other things, and I thought, well, I kind of left Baba when I was too young to understand any of this. I'll just read through the whole discourses until I get to something that I'm like, oh yeah, that makes no sense. And I just kept reading and reading and reading and reading and reading and reading, and I was just like, man, between what I know to be true in my heart and everything that Buddhist ethics and Buddhist practices teach, I can't find a single contradiction or a single thing in any of this that feels wrong. And from that point forward, for maybe a whole year and a half, I just read every Baba book I could get my hands on voraciously, and it turned from looking for a gotcha to just being absolutely overwhelmed at the truth of it, and just being like, well, if I've got the truth of the universe at my fingertips, I need to absorb as much of it as I can, possibly can.
And was there one epiphany moment, or just because I know, of course, then you came here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't say it was I would say it was more so just the reading, but the closest thing I had to an epiphany moment was when I first came back here. I went into the barn, and I think I'd started reading Baba again, but I was still skeptical, hesitant. I was always a very rebellious spirit, so in my mind I was thinking, oh, this is over and done with, and I didn't like the idea of having to not commit myself to any figure, but to worship the figure. That's one of the things I always like about the Buddha. Is Buddha was always like, don't take my word for it, come and see for yourself. And so this idea of this guy was like, love me, worship me, all to me. My rebellious spirit really resisted that. But then I sat down in the barn, probably with you.
What year would this be? Or how old were you then?
I've worked at the center long enough that I can be honest about this, I guess. This was 2021, maybe, or 2020. It was fairly recently. And so I thought, well, I don't know how to pray or necessarily believe in praying to this guy, so I'll just meditate. But I descended into this deep state of, sort of equanimous, tranquil meditation that normally on a good day would have taken me 25 minutes to get to that place, and I just sank there in about 20 seconds. And that was when I decided, okay, I'm still not sure about this, but this man was absolutely very spiritually accomplished. He was, in Buddhism, what you'd call an arahant, if nothing else. And, there's clearly a real, tangible, spiritual energy and phenomena and presence to this place. So no matter what, I'm going to play along, and I'm going to figure out what's going on here. And then, kind of it connected with everything else. At first it started, trying to look for some holes in the pattern or the scheme, and then just being slowly and then continuously just overwhelmed by the truth of everything, and, the comprehensiveness of, Baba's darshana, as Ward Parks would call it, and just the fact that it seemed to touch absolutely every facet of existence and every question you could possibly ever have, and how it all just made absolutely perfect sense with every personal experience I'd ever had and every bit of Eastern ethics and mysticism I'd studied. So it just eventually, I often joke with the center staff, some people say that, oh, they were so drawn to Baba, they love Baba so much, or, this is how they came to the center, and I always joke I'm one of those people that Baba dragged here kicking and screaming, but eventually I realized I couldn't resist, and I surrendered completely, and was happy to do so. But it took time.
And since coming to volunteer and then work at the center in the summer of 2022, I'm always amazed and appreciative of your flexibility, because I know, since I've known you since many years, that you are introspective and tend to be shy in some ways, but very full of Baba's presence, and I always am very appreciative of your working at the center, in the sense that people come and go and there's lots of interaction there. And I'm sure for you in some ways that, I don't know if that's a challenge, but it's different from what you were doing before in a certain way. Just, there's just so much going on all the time at the center.
It's absolutely a challenge, but it's obviously a very worthy challenge. Baba says, we have to have other people to find God, which was another point that made me a bit resistant. I always wanted to go meditate on a cave on a mountain. But, it's, Buddhist ethics, talks about compassion and kindness to other people, and Baba says you need other people to find God, and or to realize God within yourself, and so I view it all as important exercise. Every time I talk to somebody, Baba's doing his work on me, and I guess doing work on them too. So it's really I treat interacting with people as an exercise in the divine. That's that makes it all worth it. No matter what misgivings I might have or what mood I might be in a particular day. It's an act of worship and divinity, I suppose. Who am I to deny that? And Lord knows Jeff Wolverton does most of the work, so I don't have to worry too much.
Is there anything of Baba's that you have been reading lately that particularly resonates with you, that has been sort of stewing around?
I would say, just to be frank, Baba's teachings about how nobody need abandon their previous religion. I've found that, Baba, of course, says that, meditation of the mind is a very dry and difficult practice, and, only a few people are suited for it, and most people should just leave it be. And I think I've recently realized that for me, a meditative practice is absolutely crucial. I'm just one of those people who's too stuck in my own head to make things simple. I have to take everything and break it apart, piece by piece. But it's helpful having Baba there for guidance and reassurance. He's always that guiding light, if nothing else. But I've certainly realized, I think my path in terms of Baba might be slightly unorthodox. But I think between Baba and a Buddhist practice, who knows what the future has in store. We'll see where Baba takes me. As they say, there's some people who say, oh, I'll work at the center for a summer, and then it's 30 years later, and there's some people who say, I'll spend my entire life at the center, and they're gone after 2 years. I'll see what Baba guides me to do. Whatever brings me closer to him.
Beautiful.